We're having technical difficulties over here. No
That's
worries.
good. That's typical COVID problems, I guess. Like
Exactly. But we're
getting
going to
the
make it
camera
happen.
working. Yeah, all good.
All right. So let's get started. So welcome to today's webinar entitled Get on the Right Track, 5 Ways to Improve Rail Cybersecurity in 2021. Rail cybersecurity risks and threats are skyrocketing, and they're creating multiple challenges for everyone and for your organization as well. So in today's session, Mickey and I will tackle a few of those challenges and show you different ways to improve your security posture and as mentioned, get on the right track. Mickey, quick opener from you.
Yes, so as I mentioned, I'm happy to meet everyone virtually. Usually we are meeting face-to-face in events, but for over a year we've been sitting mostly at our homes, waiting till this whole pandemic will be over. In my opinion, it's still super important to make sure we exchange these super important security insights about railways with their entire railway community. Unfortunately, threat actors, they don't take a rest during COVID, as we've seen over the past few months. And the same, we shouldn't. We must stay connected. We must exchange the relevant security information with each other and make sure that the entire railway industry all around the world will be protected.
Great, thanks, Mickey, for your comments. So just some housekeeping. We plan on having a lengthy Q&A session at the very end. So feel free to send us your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address them later in the session. All right, so let's get down to business. In today's session, we'll try to hit on a few topics. First, the growing need for cybersecurity. In this part, we'll try to understand together how rail networks have become a target for cyber attacks in recent years. Second, we'll discuss the many challenges involved in rail cybersecurity implementations and the unique characteristics of cybersecurity in the realm of rail transport. And finally, the crux of the presentation, 5 best practices for fortifying your security posture and effective measures to secure your rail assets. The growing need for cybersecurity. Okay, let's talk about that a bit. So in the last 5 to 6 years, rail-focused cyber attacks have skyrocketed. We've seen a surge of 173%, and we estimate that that figure will be even higher by the end of this year. On average, a cyber attack or a major cyber incident against critical rail systems occurs every 30 to 33 days. This is an alarming and worrisome trend that is beginning to receive more attentive scrutiny from rail companies and governments worldwide. So if you're a chief information security officer at a rail company, this slide is your worst nightmare. These are only a handful of examples from the last 3 years or so, including, this headline on the right. This was from 2 weeks ago on a massive cyber attack against Iran's rail network. So a lot is happening, and the frequency is going up as well. Mickey, over to you.
Sure. Apart from the attacks that are growing, we see that standard bodies and regulators around the world are taking action, and this action is super important and essential for all of us. So just to list a few examples here, in the EU, we've seen different initiatives, including the Information Security Exchange Forum between railway companies that was established recently, the work as part of a Senella group in Work Group 26 that is soon to actually publish the TS57.1. Hopefully it's going to happen by the end of this month. Let's see. In the US, we've seen audits done by the TSA to different railroad companies. We've seen the American Association of Railroads publishing some security best practices for railway companies. In Asia Pacific, we've seen quite strong activity by RISB in Australia. At Cylus, we are proud to be also part of many of those activities and support them. And it's very important for us to make sure that standards are aligned. But apart from standards, today we're also going to talk about more security measures that you can implement quite directly on top of your environment. So digital transformation is already here. Railway companies are becoming more connected, technologies are being changed. And those technologies increasing the connectivity between the IT part, which used to be more aware for cybersecurity, to the OT and operational part, and all the railway applications that are in charge of train control, in charge of traffic management, in charge of signaling. All of them together are now becoming interconnected and becoming digitized. There is some complexity in the introduction of new technologies, and that complexity involves also cybersecurity. There are concepts like interoperability, which makes everything much more difficult because every problem, even from the cybersecurity perspective, that you try to change or try to fix, you need to fix all across the board, and that makes processes much slower. And the introduction of those new technologies also widens the threat vector and the attack vector towards the companies, because you might have an air-gapped system before, you might have systems that were operated mechanically, but now when you have those digitized systems that are wirelessly connected, you cannot assume anymore that they will not be targeted, and you cannot assume anymore that an attack would not make any impact on operation or on safety.
So the million-dollar question is, why are rail networks so hard to defend? Well, obviously, there are an abundance of extrinsic and intrinsic factors that can impact rail operations. However, I think we can classify most of them into three subgroups: environmental, technological, and finally operational factors. All of these make railway systems and networks unique and extremely hard to defend. So let's start with environmental factors. One, trains and rail infrastructure are geographically dispersed over countries or even continents, right? The enormity of these networks makes it extremely difficult to defend. Second, trains have multiple touch points with other infrastructure, including roads, bridges, depots, stations, crossings, etc. The complexity of these systems combined with, other major environmental aspects like that makes trains extremely difficult to defend. And finally, we're talking about moving objects, right? We're not talking about stationary equipment. We're talking about vehicles in transit with passengers on board. So obviously that makes it extremely difficult to defend, especially when it's in motion, and of course has severe risk and safety implications. Over to you, Mickey.
If we talk about technology, I always say that railways are one of the most sophisticated combinations of technologies that we see. You can have something like a telco company embedded inside the railway company. You have moving fleets. You have fixed infrastructure that can be spread over tens of thousands of kilometers. And all of those are being manufactured by different vendors. And if you want to get to a certain level of security, you need to align it across different types of equipment, which is kind of a big challenge. Of course, and we're saying it a lot, they were designed for safety and not for security. So you basically cannot assume that anything that you have in your system is secure unless you are sure that it's secure, because the general definition that was applicable until a few years till now was that it's enough to design equipment for safety and for operations. Security is not necessarily concerned. That figure has changed over the recent years because because of the increase in the attacks, because of the increase in the awareness. But still, if we look, for example, at systems, most of them are probably still don't have security inside them, and they're mostly having safety, which is completely different from security. There are different fail safety mechanisms that are great if you consider safety. Those failed safety mechanisms mean that slight changes that happen in the architecture, slight changes that happen in the behavior will cause the system to stop or just to fail safely. Failing safely is not good if you're trying to, or let's say it's not good enough if you're trying to face the increasing cyber challenges. And just wanted to add another concept that you have in railways, which is dynamic coupling. This one is quite complicated. Like in dynamic coupling, you can actually have your system, which is under security, being changed during its operation because of the introduction and disconnection of different rail cars from one each other. And this one is another like challenge because you don't necessarily have a perimeter anymore. You have systems that can be just interconnected to each other. If we look at operations, you have multiple safety levels that are interconnected with each other, and those safety levels not necessarily say something about security, but also like the interconnectivity not necessarily took into account the security concerns. You have legacy and obsolete systems, so we know that the life cycle of systems in railways is for 30 years. Think where we've been 30 years ago in terms of cybersecurity. I cannot imagine where we're going to be 30 years from now, but it means that you kind of need to live in an environment in which everything you deploy becomes legacy and obsolete from security perspective quite fast. So you need your security solutions be quite agile and make sure that they change over time to fit those emerging changes. And last but not least is a topic that we know quite well. It is patch management. And what we know about it is it's super hard to maintain in a railway environment. Why is it so hard? Because of safety, of course, and because of the fact that sometimes just to change one line of code in your software and update it in the customer environment, you actually need to go through regulatory processes in which you need to submit some updated hash file of your software, and only after it's getting approval from the government, which had the previous hash file of the software, you can actually deploy it. And if it's not like that, there is another very hard process that takes sometimes months, in which only after you pass it, you can deploy those patches. And as vulnerabilities happen all the time, it's very likely that you will just deploy a solution in your system, and it will become vulnerable without you doing anything. And it can happen within days or weeks because of the increase of the vulnerabilities, because of the increased use of off-the-shelf hardware or software, and because of just the growing pace of cyber attacks. So this one is super hard challenge that railway companies need to face, and we'll address it later on.
All right, cool. We're going to take a break, and we're going to take our first poll in this session. And the question is, have you performed a rail cybersecurity risk assessment in the last 3 years, right? So there's just one answer over here, but a few options. No, yes, we have also implemented security controls as a result. Yes, that's option number 3, but we haven't implemented security measures yet. And 4, not applicable. Okay, let's launch the poll.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the audience is going to react to that.
Yes, indeed.
I think we have quite a good set of railway cybersecurity professionals over here, so I'm sure the answers will be interesting.
Okay, let's give it another 15 seconds. 15 seconds. All right, we're almost at 70%. 5 more seconds. All right.
Come on, Daniel, show us the answers.
All right. So,
No one has.
very, very interesting results. So 18% said no, answered no, right? they haven't performed a risk assessment in the last 3 years. 45% have answered yes, and they have implemented security controls as a result of that risk assessment. 12% answered yes, but they haven't implemented security measures yet, and 24% answered that this isn't applicable. So very, very interesting results. It seems that the majority of the group, they have actually conducted some sort of risk assessment in the last 3 years, and that's actually good news. So, Mickey, any comments?
No, I think those results are like at least in the area of improvement. I remember like if we would probably ask the same question 3 years ago, it would look differently. And it's good to see like we have more people moving toward the yes columns, which is good. And I think that like hopefully like if we schedule the same webinar like 3 years from now, or even hopefully shorter, hopefully in 2 years as well, we'll see also most people moving into implementing the right security measures.
Okay, great. All right, perfect. Let's move on. So you should all ask yourself a very simple question. With existing tools or solutions, can I be certain that I've been attacked, right? Or have not been attacked? If you can't answer that question, then you have a serious problem. And this problem can result in a few very, very negative outcomes, okay, or potential outcomes. First and foremost, increased risk to passenger safety. Cyber attacks can potentially result in safety incidents with fatalities and injuries or physical damage to wayside or onboard equipment. Second, extremely high operational costs due to like a stacked cybersecurity approach, right? Meaning multiple tools that haven't been designed to be implemented together, and they're somewhat patched. Third, direct heavy economic losses due to downtime. Now, just imagine how much money is lost in, let's say, 2 hours of downtime in a major metropolitan area in Europe or in the United States. Could easily amount to tens of millions of dollars in direct and indirect losses. Fourth, not complying with regulations or industry standards. This may impair relationships with regulators, result in fines, or increase spending on compliance consulting, right? And finally, something that we call stifled business growth, right? Or stifled business and operational growth. And what we mean by that is like when a railway company plans a new project or plans to expand an existing line or lines, then they may be reluctant to move forward with plans without adequate cyber protection for critical rail assets, right? And that reluctance may result in lost revenue, lost growth potential, or even impair, different passenger services. So we are going to move on and move forward in the presentation. This is the crux of today's presentation: 5 best practices for fortifying your security posture. All right. So it goes without saying that you can only protect what you see. And that's a formidable task, right? Especially in sizable railway networks, and due to a few reasons. One, enormous networks with a high number of critical rail assets, signaling, rolling stock systems, et cetera, et cetera. 2, legacy systems that were not designed with cybersecurity in mind. 3, the unique complexity of signaling and onboard systems that requires a specialized approach to discovering them and monitoring them in real time. So the ideal solution should defend these critical assets at the source, right? With full automation. It should preferably be driven by machine learning, and it should be built specifically for the rail industry, right? Though it's extremely important that a solution like this provides more visibility to the operator, and is based on automatic discovery and automatic monitoring. Nikki, over to you.
Great. So as a second concept, we want to introduce a concept called virtual patching, which I'm not sure that all of you are familiar with. This concept is about how do you immunize your network from known vulnerabilities, and we already discussed how difficult patch management is in the rail environment. So the way we propose in dealing with it is that, so if you cannot upgrade the software when a new vulnerability is discovered, and we already realize that we can't, you can actually do other things to mitigate risks posed by the software. And we already seen some companies mitigating risk, but for example, conducting risk analysis after some vulnerability is being published. But what if you could automatically identify vulnerable assets? What if you could, for example, reacting to new vulnerabilities or newly found vulnerabilities and mitigating their exploitation without actually interfering with the network? So that's the concept that we propose following. And it means that maybe you cannot update all of your software to be the most up-to-date and the most immune, but at the same time, you can also mitigate risks by making sure that this software is not being exploited by a threat actor. The third concept we want to discuss is segmentation, and it's how do you actually isolate threats and make sure that they are all contained between different security zones and not proliferating to the other parts of the networks. And the old-fashioned approach for those is firewalls. Firewalls are security measures that were built in the past, and they're kind of more like a legacy approaches, because we see that in reality, most companies have firewalls, and most firewalls are being bypassed, especially when you're not expecting it to happen. Why is it like that? Because they're quite hard to maintain, especially in the rail environment. In a rail environment, most of the applications passing through firewalls are kind of applications that are proprietary. Firewalls are not built to protect against those types of applications. And what does it mean? It means that your policies will probably become too permissive when you configure those firewalls. So the solution to that is actually like containing and understanding the concept of segmentation in your network, and standards like IEC 62443 provide best practices for that. And if you can actually automatically divide your system into different security zones and conduits, and if you can actually enforce the policies between the different security zones and the ones that should pass through the conduits, that will be a good way for you to make sure that threats are contained in a specific part of your system without actually, again, modifying the system, because we know how hard it is. So the fourth concept we want to discuss is access control and policy enforcement, and let's start it by example. When we go to different types of operation control centers, we usually see this common bad practice, which is kind of like the nominal practice of how do operators use their workstations. And the unfortunate answer for security is that most workstations are being used with default passwords. Sometimes the same password is being used for all the users. Sometimes the same user is being used for all the people that are working in the operation control center. And of course, I don't need to tell you how bad it is, because you cannot actually know who is in control of the station. But that's just one problem. And the reason for that is quite, let's say, because of operation practices. Another problem that there is that even if someone, let's say that there is a great access control management system, and that there is a way for you to actually to identify when users are trying to brute force the system, the default response in such a case cannot be locking out the user, which is something that you could do in enterprise network but at the same time, you cannot do in an operational environment, or at least you're not recommended to do so, because you don't want to, because of a mistake of one user or because it's a bit tired, to lock his workstation and prevent trains from moving from one place to another. And that's kind of a bad situation. And what we frequently see is, because of this dilemma and because of this trade-off that we see here between operation and security, sometimes like the companies just pick one side. They're saying, all right, let's focus on operations. Let's forget about security. We cannot implement security in this use case. And that's kind of also like a common practice. It's either like 0 or 1. It's either you like implement security or not implement security. But sometimes you can get in between. How do you get in between? You can compensate on that. How do you actually compensate on that? The way you do it is by actually, again, monitoring the same policies that you don't want users to follow, or sorry, the ones that you want the users to follow, and monitor like deviations from those policies. When you do that, you can actually respond to such an event. You can understand whether such an event happened because the operator just mistyped his password, or it's because someone actually got control and trying to brute force the workstation is currently in. And those are just a few examples, but what the examples here are trying to say, you can actually follow those practices. You can follow good security practices, but at the same time not changing the way you do, for example, access control. And hopefully in future systems, those will be also enforced by design.
Early in the session, we discussed a fundamental question that each and every one of you should be able to answer. Have I been attacked, right? The main challenge you face in this area is that traditional threat detection solutions, firewalls, intrusion detection, etc., are ineffective in the real environment, and for a few reasons. One, most threat detection solutions are one-dimensional, right? They defend against known or very, very specific threats or particular attack vectors. Two, most of these defenses are effective maybe in IT networks, but totally futile in the rail operational layer. Finally, most of the generic OT solutions, the OT security solutions, are unable to deal with the unique detection needs in rail environments. They're unable to effectively detect, threats in critical assets that are directed against the logic, in signaling or rolling stock systems, which are usually based on proprietary protocols. Lastly, many of the threat detection tools out there just provide what we call shallow inspection, or while advanced threats typically require more advanced detection that's based on DPI, on deep packet inspection. So these challenges require a solution that is tailored to the rail environment and that provides a 360 kind of approach and can deal with the sophisticated attacks out there, that are launched or potentially launched by powerful players, for instance, nation states or cyber terrorists, etc. All right, we are gonna take another break and take our second poll in this session. So the question is, when it comes to rail cybersecurity, which of these potential outcomes keeps you up at night? You can actually select a couple. One, increased risk to passenger safety. Two, losses due to downtime. Three, high operational costs. And number four, stifled business growth and operational growth as well. So I'm just going to launch the poll and go ahead.
let's see, what do you think, Daniel, will be the answer to that?
Well, I don't know. I can see the results in progress actually, so that would be cheating.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, it's always hard to guess. It really depends on the company itself and the current situation.
That's true. That's totally true. Okay, let's give it another 15 seconds. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to close the poll. Let's share the results.
Oh.
Very interesting. So, increased risk to passenger safety, 71% voted for that option. 55% voted for losses due to downtime. 32% for high operational costs, and 16% selected the fourth option, stifle business and operational growth. So again, fascinating results. I obviously, since passenger safety and mitigating, risks that may impact safety is, it's paramount. So I'm not surprised about that result, but I am a bit surprised about the other results on downtime losses, operational costs, and stifled business growth. Mickey, any comments?
Yes, so we actually see that this connection between safety and security becomes quite essential in terms of like you cannot be safe if you're not secure. So it makes sense that more people will think that way, and that's completely right in my opinion. And there's nothing more important than the lives of the people. I think that there's actually an underestimation in terms of like how should you deal with the digital transformation. Some of it happens like quite independently of the security processes, and like the fact that companies are upgrading equipment to a new generation or something that is more digital is always sounds good in terms of like what benefit will it bring in terms of operation and also safety, but sometimes security gets neglected over there. So I think that those should be much more tied together. At the same time, the rest are also super important. So it's kind of a tough one.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Mickey. Gonna hide the results and move forward. All right, introducing Cylus 1. So Cylus, Cylus's portfolio of solutions was designed to meet the unique cybersecurity needs of the rail industry. And our portfolio includes 2 flagship products, Cylus 1 for signaling, which protects rail systems and assets from cyber threats, by monitoring the signaling and control networks, including trackside devices, interlocking, and management workstations. The second product that we offer is Cylus 1 for rolling stock, and that protects onboard operational systems and passenger comfort systems. And again, it protects them from cyber threats and other impending threats or risks out there. Again, the integration is seamless and it provides maximum security with no disruption to operations or any major, or in fact any changes to the architecture. Over to you, Mickey.
So I'll quickly elaborate over some of the core capabilities Cylus 1 provides. Of course, many of them are in the spirit of those controls that we mentioned, because we understand that those are the most important challenges that railway companies have. So in terms of core capabilities, we provide the full visibility and asset inventory. The asset inventory and visibility we provide are the deepest that you can get. They actually take into account all the unique railway properties. They take into account the vulnerabilities of the assets. They take into account the different interconnections between railway systems to make sure that those are being presented to the users in the best possible way. It provides you with threat detection and scoring of risks. The threat detection is based on deep packet inspection, anomaly detection, machine learning algorithms that are patented. And all of those technologies together enable you to actually protect yourself against different types of threats, from the level of the non-vulnerability to the level of the attack that can compromise your safety systems. The solution is built in a way that it provides you with very strong mitigation capabilities, because it's not enough to have a great alerting mechanism. It's also important to have a very simple way to mitigate all of those threats and to get the right instructions and the right integrations to make everything work together. And it's all done to reduce the mean time to respond, the mean time to detect, of course. It's connected within your entire railway ecosystem and can communicate with the different security solutions or railway solutions that you have in your company. It's operable by railway operations people as well as by cybersecurity people. And it, last but not least, it also assists you with compliance processes. So that's something that we see, which is becoming more important when you start tying security into the essential processes in the railway. You also want to make sure that you meet the best practices. So we talked about IEC 62443, and there is also TS 5701. And our solution actually helps you to answer the different requirements while also getting great ROI doing that.
Key takeaways. So a few key takeaways from today's session. So first, cyber attacks are on the rise. This problem is not going away anytime soon. On the contrary, it's exacerbating. Like, it's high time for rail companies to increase their threat awareness and implement new technologies, new practices. It's also time to adopt cybersecurity thinking at every level in the organization, right? At the project level and, of course, at the management level. Second, rail companies should view cybersecurity as an economic problem with crystal clear ROI, right? Downtime losses, safety incidents, physical damage to equipment, high operational costs, etc., are all measurable risks, right? And they potentially may have a significant impact on your top and bottom lines. Mickey, over to you.
We've discussed compensating control, and those are an effective mechanism to satisfy security requirements. So usually security is not necessarily something that you either do or do not do. You have a lot of in between. And what we've discussed here are actually practical measures that you can implement quite immediately. It's something that you can implement within days and not waiting to the next generation of systems that may come in a few years and also will replace only partially your systems. So what's important here, and that's a very important takeaway from this talk, is that all the practices and measures that you can implement are such that are entirely based on not changing your existing architecture and just adding something on top of it. And that's important. And the last point, which is important for now, but also for the future, is that there need to be solutions that eliminate the trade-off between safety and security. Living in an environment with such a trade-off is something that for the long run would be complicated. And we believe that when companies are addressing the cybersecurity threats and when they're addressing cybersecurity challenges, the processes must move quicker than the processes of safety. And therefore, like also from the architecture perspective or from the technology perspective, you must make your security solutions so robust that they will not depend on passing through safety processes in order to mitigate a high-risk vulnerability.
All right, thank you, Mickey. So we're gonna move on to a quick Q&A. And actually, we received quite a few questions. So we have a question from Kobe Ben Aaron. Is it possible to expand and say something more on virtual patching, Mickey?
Sure, of course. Yeah, so virtual patching is basically a concept, which is a core capability we also have in our product, but it's an overall concept. And this concept is that when you in the spectrum between not patching at all to patching every day, for example, you also can fit somewhere in between. And it means that the reason that you do patches initially is to make sure that your assets are not being compromised. Because new vulnerabilities can expose something to, for example, privilege escalation, to remote code execution, or something similar. And you also want to be aware if something happens with the spirit in your environment, even if you cannot patch it. So that's what we're trying to highlight here, is that it's not about patching or unpatching equipment. Of course, like when there's the latest CVE, you would like to patch it, but reality, we see it's kind of not practical in many of those environments. We see that those processes takes months, they sometimes takes years. Sometimes you don't even want to start such a process because what you think about it, and when you're going to finish this process, you need to patch it once again. So what we suggest here is actually monitoring closely the unpatched assets and see whether they're being compromised or there is a sign of someone trying to leverage the attack vector, as well as to mitigate the risks by those unpatched assets by, for example, better configuring your network or adding better segmentation. If you know that there is a very critical asset that is becoming super connected, you may want to reconsider it if it's currently unpatched with high severity vulnerabilities. So you need to find those trade-offs. So that's the overall concept of this virtual patching.
Great. Thanks, Mickey. So we have a few more questions over here. This is a question from Rob. What are the requirements to deploy your solution? Does it require changes to the architecture, et cetera, et cetera? Is it a physical or virtual appliance? Mickey?
Sure, so I'll elaborate on that. So the way customers deploy our Cylus One solution is usually by making a very small configuration to their network, for example, adding a span port and configuring just port mirroring. And once they do that, the deployment of the solution is straightforward. It's being done only software-based. It also can be done based on the hardware, but it's off the shelf. So it's software-based appliance that you can just install in your network within and get the value within minutes. We actually in one of our latest customers, we got discovering all of its assets within 3.5 minutes. So you get your value immediately, and from there on, it's very easy to operate by both security and really professionals.
Awesome. We have another question on deployments, and that is, how long does it take to deploy Cylus One?
So as I mentioned, deploying Cylus One is a process that can take you sometimes less than 1 day in many sites. So that's a very simple solution to deploy, can be done straightforward, remotely, on site. So really support different modes of configuration. And I'll be happy to elaborate also about that to anyone who's interested in following this webinar.
So our last question, again from Kobe, is about remote access monitoring. And Mickey, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so remote access monitoring is something that we see quite a lot in the environments that we are at. So for example, mostly rolling stock fleets, but also wayside devices are being connected to sometimes it's vendor sides or sometimes it's some other third party. And we found out that this use case is super important because those maintenance procedures or monitoring procedures, they happen quite frequently. And you want to know if someone else outside the system is now connected to your system, because this link can be leveraged also by threat actors. And when you monitor the system holistically, as we do, you can actually get the insights about it. And practically, the more important part here is that you need to keep tight all those connections from the outside world that connect to your equipment. But as soon as they do, you still need to monitor, you need to make sure you don't trust anything. You need to make sure you don't assume that anything happens that everything will work as anticipated, because like if you start trusting connections, that becomes a problem. So that's why zero trust is also an important concept that we support. And like you need to make sure you contain, you make sure that you reduce the access as much as possible, as well as monitor everything that happens to make sure that if any abnormal behavior happens, you are able to alert on it and to act upon it, of course.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mickey. And thank you, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this this webinar. It was a pleasure. I hope we were able to provide some interesting insights and key takeaways on this important topic. So again, for more information, questions, or even to provide feedback, please contact us directly at Mickey at Cylus.com, Daniel at Cylus.com. And again, we'd love to hear from you guys and hear your feedback and and continue the conversation. So thank you so much, Mickey. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Daniel. You were great.
Thanks.
You're a great moderator here, and thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Bye.